Borderlands 3 is an amazing game that has made a bunch of significant improvements over Borderlands 2. However, there are still quite a few things that Borderlands 3 did not improve on, and even a couple of things that it seems to have actually done worse. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is 5 things that Borderlands 3 did worse than Borderlands 2. Starting off the list, we have the menus. The menus in Borderlands 3 are an interesting case, because while yes, they look really nice, and in theory they should work better than those in Borderlands 2, they just don't. The menus in Borderlands 3 are just full of glitches and issues that quite frankly ruin the experience of using it. The 3D map was a really cool idea, but it doesn't matter if the map is 3D if it doesn't even let you examine the icons on that map. And it's not just the map either. The inventory sometimes just doesn't respond when I try to swap weapons, and the main menu is lacking a lot of features that Borderlands 2's had, like being able to open character selection with a hotkey. And don't even get me started with the constant issues that plague ultra-wide monitor users like myself. There are a lot of small issues with Borderlands 3's menus like this that by themselves aren't that big of a deal, but altogether make me wish that they just reused the menus in Borderlands 2, because trying to use Borderlands 3's menu is a giant headache. Something pretty controversial that Gearbox did with Borderlands 3 was decide to not have DLC Vault Hunters, which is something that really hurt the replayability of Borderlands 3. While you could argue that they made up for that by expanding on their current Vault Hunters with the constant buffs and even an additional skill tree, I still think it would have been way better to have additional Vault Hunters rather than one additional skill tree per Vault Hunter. After all, DLC Vault Hunters were some of the most fun to play from the previous games, and while I get why Gearbox made this choice, I still have to wonder what the 5th and 6th Vault Hunters could have been like in Borderlands 3. It was pretty much impossible to make this list without saying something about Borderlands 3's story. Borderlands 3's story has quite possibly been the most hated part of the game. Since day one, there have been people complaining about the game's story, saying that it feels bland, dull, and just overall really bad. From Maya's death to Troy and Tyrene's character arc, and even leaving certain characters out of the main story to make way for new characters. I am never going to say that Borderlands 3's story was better than Borderlands 2's, but I will say that Borderlands 3's story gets way too much hate. Problem with the story in Borderlands 3 isn't that it's bad, it's just that trying to compete with Borderlands 2's story is next to impossible. Borderlands 2's story was one of the most amazing stories in all of the games I've ever played, and trying to compete with it is an incredibly difficult task. While Borderlands 3's story isn't bad, it definitely is way worse than Borderlands 2's. Another really big issue with Borderlands 3 has just been farming in general. Gearbox has been very indecisive with how they've wanted farming to be in this game. At first, farming was more like Borderlands 1, with most of the drops not having a good, reliable, dedicated drop, and world drop farms being the best way to get good loot. However, this also led to world drop rates being astronomically high, way higher than they've been in any previous games. While Gearbox has tried to change the majority of farming back to the way it was in Borderlands 2, some players still think that farming for gear in this game is way too difficult, while the other half of the fanbase feels the exact opposite. As of right now, I feel that weapon farming is in a pretty good spot for difficulty. However, with the way that class mods and artifacts work now, the rarity of good versions of them is far higher than it's ever been, and that's honestly where my biggest issue with farming is. It seems like no matter what Gearbox does with item rarity, they just won't be able to please everybody. But I'm sure no one would complain if they brought back pearlescence. The honorable mention for this list is Borderlands 3's endgame. When Borderlands 3 first launched, it had essentially zero endgame. There weren't any raid bosses, there were no overly difficult mobbing sections like the Digi Peak or the takedowns that we have now, and honestly, that was really disappointing. Borderlands 2's endgame felt basically endless, with 2 raid bosses in the base game and 2 or more being added with every story DLC. With all of the DLC and content, Borderlands 2 had 10 total raid bosses, giving players at endgame a lot to work towards. However, with Borderlands 3 and all of its DLC and content, there are only 3 raid bosses, and only one of the raid bosses were the traditional form of raid that players are used to. On top of all of this, the endgame content that Borderlands 3 does have feels kind of lacking. For example, the Guardian Takedown was an absolute flop when it first launched, and even today, after all of its adjustments, it still feels like an absolute slog to get through, and honestly, it isn't even that rewarding. Borderlands 3's endgame has improved significantly since launch though, but it is still far worse than the endgame in Borderlands 2. And finally, one of the biggest things that Borderlands 3 did worse than Borderlands 2 is the weapon variety system. For anyone who doesn't know what I mean by that, I'm talking about the anointment system from Borderlands 3 versus the weapon parts system from every other Borderlands game. Weapon parts were a huge part of the Borderlands series ever since the first game, where certain part combinations could make some of the most overpowered gear imaginable, and it seems weird for Gearbox to have phased them out the way that they have. I know that there still are weapon parts in Borderlands 3, and I know that they do have an effect on a gun's performance, but weapon parts are clearly not meant to be focused on in Borderlands 3. The difference that weapon parts make to a weapon's stats are basically unnoticeable. Weapon parts only give a tiny stat increase or decrease in Borderlands 3, whereas in Borderlands 2, having the wrong stock on a sniper rifle could essentially make it unusable. In Borderlands 3, the focus has switched from weapon parts to the new anointment system that is ultimately super flawed. Anointments in this game feel like a necessary component of farming any weapon, as a bad gun with a good anointment will often outperform a good gun with a bad anointment. The anointment system itself seems forced too, as if you're not using the best anointment on your gun, you're losing an insane chunk of damage. Not to mention the fact that most of the anointments are based on action skills start and end, which leaves a bunch of action skills, and even an entire character struggling to use them effectively. The only purpose that anointments really serve in Borderlands 3 is adding yet another variable to farming. They don't really provide any extra build variety, as oftentimes it's the same 3 or 4 anointments being used across all characters. I personally think that anointments are possibly the worst addition to Borderlands 3, and if Gearbox removed them and rebalanced loot to account for that, Borderlands 3 would be way better off for it. I have a lot more to say about the anointment system in Borderlands 3, but I don't have the time in this video. However, if you would like to see a separate video going more in depth about why I think the anointment system is flawed, then be sure to let me know in the comment section of this video. With all this said though, I do still love Borderlands 3 as a whole. The gameplay itself feels way smoother than any other game in the series, and the variety of guns and builds available at endgame is just amazing. Neither Borderlands 2 or 3 are perfect in any way, which is why I will be releasing another video about the 5 things Borderlands 2 did worse than Borderlands 3, which should be coming out the same time next week. But that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see all of you in the next one.